Holy did we just see what we thought we saw?
So many people have said, Hell in a Cell, it's the first match I was shown, and now I'm a huge fan. And my follow-up question is always, did you expect all the matches to be like that? Because they're not.
I thought that was the end of him.
The Undertaker said, see if he's alive.
It's crazy that they would allow someone to go unconscious and then continue the match.
All of us need to ask ourselves the question, was it worth it?
Dark Side of the Ring. New season premieres Tuesday, March 25th at 10 on Vice.
And we welcome you to a brand new season of Dark Side of the Ring on This Is Wrestling. It is Versage and Zach McGibbon. We will cover each and every episode of the 2025 Dark Side of the Ring season. Looking forward to it very much, Zach McGibbon, to get into a new crop and lots of interesting stories, starting with a very famous one in the first one. How you doing?
Doing pretty good, Lee. Yeah, this is going to be interesting. Obviously, we got some tremendous feedback from our review of the Vince series on Netflix and also the Who Killed WCW series as well, and how we were able to look at that. So this is kind of our first foray into Dark Side in terms of this format, and so I'm really looking forward to it. It's been a tremendous show, and it's insane to think that we're in season 6 for this with Dark Side of the Ring, and still quite a few topics that they're able to get through for this season, especially with this first one. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, it should be really good. And one of the things that I think you and I are both looking forward to, we went through it on a previous kind of regular episode of This Is Wrestling, which you can also listen to and subscribe. We are with you at least once, if not twice a week on This Is Wrestling, that we kind of went through all of the stories that are going to be in the 2025 season. And there's a lot of intriguing ones, and we'll cover them from Ludwig Borga to Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert to Daphne to like a lot of different stories that I necessarily, I think as we're both big wrestling fans, we know some of the stories, but there are some ones here on the list, Zach, that quite frankly, I don't know as much about as, say, our first one that we're going to dive into in a second, that is a very famous one. But I think there's a lot of good stories coming up in the 2025 season that even if you're a pretty hardcore wrestling fan, you probably don't know everything about all of these stories. And that's what I love about this series.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that there with Ludwig Borga. That's going to be the one for me that will be a lot of new information. I just know him as that guy in the mid 90s. And I know he had the one UFC fight on pay-per-view. I think it was with Dan Severn. But other than that, that's really it when it comes to Ludwig Borga. So that's going to be an interesting one. So a lot of interesting topics that is being discussed here, and other things that we might be able to learn some new information on. So this should be interesting.
But we start with episode number 1 and a very, very famous night in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Hell in a Cell, The Undertaker and Mick Foley. When you look back, Zach, I understand why they kind of started with something this big, because even if you're a casual wrestling fan and you know the name of Mick Foley, if you hear Hell in the Cell, probably the thing that you think about is Mick Foley being thrown off the top of the cage. It's one of the more infamous, memorable moments in the history of professional wrestling, for better or for worse. So at least I understand from the Dark Side of the Ring perspective, which obviously Dark Side of the Ring means this probably is not going to end well, or it's not a happy-go-lucky ending as some other stories are. But I do understand the philosophy of digging into something that's this memorable to a lot of people, to try and tell people more. For people like you and me, and I think some hardcore wrestling fans, we've heard a lot about this incident. I lived it. I remember watching it live and being sort of aghast as to the line between what reality is in the world of professional wrestling. And this one certainly had that and more. So maybe just start from the perspective of why you think, and if it was a good decision for Dark Side of the Ring to delve into something this famous, because like we just talked about, I think when you get to some of the other stories this season, they are not as known to people as this one is.
Yeah, I was wondering the thought process into going into this, because it was something that it has been talked about quite a bit. And I was listening to some interviews with the main guy behind Dark Side of the Ring, and he was talking about how, essentially each season there is kind of that standout topic that people will talk about. One season it was about Chris Benoit, the other season about Owen Hart. Some of these more infamous moments in wrestling history. And so I think it kind of follows that same line of thinking, where this is something where, as you mentioned, anyone that's even a casual wrestling fan would know about this moment. It's something that's been replayed over and over again with Mick Foley, falling off of the Hell in a Cell cage, among other things that happened in the match. And it's something that continues to be discussed. And so, like what you said, when it's something that you and I and other hardcore wrestling fans have discussed about for years, this is kind of an opportunity to really present more of the inside story to a more casual audience. So I think it just kind of comes down to trying to find that one big topic to be sort of the, I don't want to say theme, but the big, drawing episode for Dark Side of the Ring. And then you have your other episodes that kind of keep the viewers, tuning in, because there's a reason why it was the first one, right? Like, this is the biggest, this is the most known one. It's like, wow, this is kind of interesting how they said this story. I wonder how these other stories in the season will go.
Well, that's exactly it. You can't start with Ludwig Borga, even if it's the most interesting one you've done all season, because nobody knows who he is.
Yeah.
So the casual fan, you're premiering the new season, you start with, very famous people, and that's how you get them into it. And this one is to attract the casual fan to be able to keep watching, because the hardcore wrestling fan who wants to know more always are going to watch. Like, I would watch this series no matter what. You didn't have to start with The Undertaker and Mick Foley Hell in the Cell for me to watch this series. But I do understand when you're trying to get that casual audience hooked in, you have to start with something that they know. And of all the episodes, this is probably the one that people will latch on to the most, saying, yeah, I know who The Undertaker is. Oh, I know who Mick Foley is. So I totally understand from that perspective. Let me ask you, before we get into some of the details, one of the big questions as I was watching this was, they had all the people, and you almost have to, right? Like, you had Mick Foley, you had his wife, you had his 2 kids, you had Gerald Briscoe, who was the main agent of the match. You had Jimmy Corderas. You had a lot of people that were directly involved in this incident. What about not having The Undertaker? Did that strike you as, like, I get it, he works for the WWE. They're not going to associate themselves necessarily with Dark Side of the Ring. But did you think that this story was properly told with a lot of important people? The doctor that was looking after Mick Foley, who, by the way, posing like a wrestler in front of the camera, I'm not sure is the way to come across as, I'm the head doctor, I'm the head physician, and I'm posing like a wrestler. Look at me. Like, okie doke. But I thought they had a lot of important people, but they didn't have The Undertaker. They had his voice a couple of times. It was clearly recorded from something else that they threw in there. He wasn't doing that for the show. Do you think that this story was properly told without a first-hand account of The Undertaker?
I think for what they were able to utilize, I think if they didn't have anything from The Undertaker, I don't think it would have been fully captured, but they did use that audio, as you mentioned. It would have been nice, obviously, to have that first-person perspective from, the other guy in the match, really. But I think with the thing with the Mankind Undertaker stuff is that, while yes, Undertaker certainly has his role in the match, the thing that people talk about is just the insane amount of bumps that Mick Foley took. And so he was, to me, the key guy you kind of need to tell this story correctly. So I thought it was sufficient enough with The Undertaker, where what they were able to utilize with him, taking some audio, whether it be from a podcast interview or something like that he did. I felt it was pretty sufficiently told, just based on, what I've heard about this story in the past and whatnot. And so I didn't have too much of an issue with it. If there was no audio of The Undertaker or any sort of input from The Undertaker on this, I'd probably say it would feel a bit incomplete, but I think they were able to supplement that with that audio. So I thought it was pretty well done.
Yeah, for me, it was well done. And it was as much, you have to make a decision. Is this worth doing? And can we get enough other people to be able to make this into a good television show, a good story, to tell this story properly? Can we do that without The Undertaker? And the answer was yes. At the end of it, for sure. I think they told enough of the story. I thought there was a little bit missing. Just from the perspective of, there are a couple of questions that I would have liked to have known what The Undertaker was feeling and thinking during the time of, number one, what was his thought process before he was going to throw, and then as he threw Mick Foley over and saw him laying there, what was he thinking? I also want to know what he was thinking when he chokeslammed him through the top of the cage and the cage broke and it went down and everybody rushed to him. I would have liked a really good firsthand account of those things to tell the story properly. I felt it was missing, but I also think they got 90% of the story. And yes, I was left with those questions that I wanted to know, but for the rest of it, I thought they told a good story. So let me ask you first. We'll get to the part, because The Undertaker throwing Mick Foley, Mankind, off of the cage is what everybody remembers. It's the massive visual of this. This was a planned stunt. This was something they tried to do. And do you think, looking back on it, that it was either the right thing to do, or do you think that this was a happy accident that it turned out as famous as it did?
I think the way with this match now, with the benefit of hindsight and going back into the match, it had been a while since I had watched back this match and had all the memories kind of come back just from rewatching it many years after it had taken place. They talked about in the show how they were trying to one up the previous Hell in a Cell match with Shawn Michaels and Undertaker. And this was one of the ways that they were able to do that. And so it's tough, because it's one of those sacrifices that wrestlers take, especially in the case of Mick Foley. I think they certainly thought this was going to be memorable. I don't think people thought that it would go to the lengths that it is now, where, Mick Foley was doing stand-up tours based around this one match and telling the story many years later. So I think it ended up being a happy accident in the end, of just how much the legacy of this match is kind of held on. And I think it's not even just, him falling off of the cage into the announce table, and it's something else we'll discuss here, but also, him getting choke slammed right to the center of the mat with no give, and that chain link, that chain link panel there on the cage breaking through. So I think it ended up being a happy accident for them in terms of just the legacy of this. I think this was something that they wanted to have, that visual, but I think everything that happened after that match really kind of added to the gravitas of this Hell in a Cell match.
So one thing I think that confused me a little bit is that when he got tossed off of the top of the cage, there's nothing you can do to fake that, right?
Yep.
It's just, this is going to be real, and we're going to hope that he's okay. It could have gone very wrong. And we could be talking about, people have really hurt themselves. You think of Chris Bay, you think of Draws, you think of other people that have really injured themselves critically and taken them out of the sport, doing a lot less than what Mick Foley was doing. So there's nothing you can do to fake that. And that blurred the line considerably, I think, for a lot of people in that time, that wrestling's fake. And you show them that, and even the most skeptical of people in the world of professional wrestling, you can't watch that clip and go, yeah, but there's padding, and yeah, but this and that. You can't watch it and say that. It's just real. A lot of the descriptions afterwards with people like, this is real, we brought the gurney out, and certainly they needed to check on him. I felt like at some point in this part of the show that they didn't explain as well as I would have liked that the plan all along was to get up off of that gurney. That show was not over, and there was more planned parts of the match as he was going to be taken out. So I thought it was a little bit misleading for those that were talking about it, the Doctor and Jimmy Corderas and some of the people, Gerald Briscoe, that we thought that this was the end. No, you didn't, because there was a lot of things planned. Now, he could have been hurt enough to not continue, but that was not the plan. And they kind of made it seem like once he got tossed off the top, that was the plan. Like he was really hurt, and this was going to be the end. What did you make of that situation?
Yeah, it was kind of weird how they laid that out. It felt like to me as I was watching it, where it was them trying to protect kayfabe in a sense of try and keep the mystique of the match.
Yeah.
Because, if you just think about it a little bit further, would they really be holding on to that camera to him on the gurney and then just holding on and on and on, and Undertaker would still be up on the cage, right? Like it wouldn't make sense on that front. I always was under the belief, and just based on listening back and reading through it, that, he would fall off the cage, and then, as you mentioned, this would be a case where, yes, you would absolutely have to check on him, especially with the way that, he bounced off of the announce table and went underneath a bit of the steel fencing there, the barricade, that you would want to check on him. But the way that match laid out, that seemed to be the plan of him going back up there and getting everything done. So that first part always felt like to me was part of the match, and the way that they kind of told it did feel a little bit like the people at WWE trying to protect the mystique of it and not actually breaking down, okay, this was part of the plan, we're going to try and sell this a little bit before eventually Mick Foley, essentially in a way rises from the dead, from the gurney, to go back up and show how crazy he is. Mm-hmm. So it definitely felt like them trying to maintain kayfabe, for lack of a better term.
Right. So this is the part I didn't understand, because Dark Side of the Ring is, I feel like, not supposed to protect kayfabe, but they're supposed to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
They're not supposed to protect the business. They're trying to tell you what happens beyond the business. That's why I watch it, to find out that stuff. And so I didn't like that part of it, because the only thing I wanted to know in that spot is somebody getting into the ear of Mick Foley saying, like, I know you're really hurt. Are you with it? Are you going to be able to go on? Like, can we finish this? And he would have told them yes, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So we didn't hear that. I would have liked to have heard that in that spot. That at some point, somebody whispered in his ear, like, are you going to continue? Yes. I'm hurt, but I'm okay. I'm going to continue. Because they didn't make it seem that way. And I only bring all of this up not to rip a hole in it, but it wasn't, I don't know how long it would have been, not very long later, where he got chokeslammed at the top of the cage and he went right through the cage, and that was not a planned spot, and the chair falling down on top of his mouth was also not planned. And you could see the difference. Like, to me, it's crazy. Like, it's a wild spot, but in comparison to what had just happened, it wasn't as wild. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, which is again crazy to think about with that.
It is, for sure, because if that they just did that spot, it's wild. But it's just not as crazy as the first one.
Yeah.
But when you go back and watch this, and maybe you have to go back and watch it again, when you go back and watch it, you watch the people rush to Mick Foley the second time as opposed to the first time. For a guy that got thrown off the top of the cage onto a announcing booth table from 20 odd feet, doing a somersault in midair, there was people that went to him, but not in this, I'm really, really worried about him part. It was kind of it's still part of this show. Not the second time.
No, definitely not.
They rushed to him because he was unconscious. It was not planned. He fell very hard. So to me, Zach, the difference and why I bring all of that up, the protecting of the first spot, was because in the second spot that did not happen. Talk about the way that you saw that second spot. And even to me, I know it wasn't planned, but earlier in the match, the Mick Foley had said, I put the Undertaker in a position to be suplexed, and he called it off because he was worried about falling through the zip ties. Like, the top of the cage was tied on with zip ties.
Yeah.
And the Undertaker called the spot off, not wanting to fall through the top of the cage. What did they think was going to happen when the Undertaker chokeslammed a 300-pound guy through the cage? They must have known that that was a possibility, but I want to hear your thoughts on all of the second one that was much more real. And I mean that from a unplanned point of view, because they're obviously both very real. But the first one was a planned real spot. The second one was an unplanned real spot.
Yeah. In that case with the suplex, I think that was a different part of the cage. And so that's why they kind of called it off. Because obviously they did the choke slam right to the center of the top of the cage. And so the way that they described it was they wanted the visual of, like, because they knew that the cage was kind of sinking in. They wanted to have that visual of Mick Foley kind of sinking into the cage as opposed to obviously falling through, which is what happened. And so, as you mentioned, they had all these zip ties attached to the top of the cage, and you could actually see it in the clip when he falls down. You see some of those zip ties falling also to the center of the ring right around Mick Foley. And so clearly not a planned spot. I mean, you think of they imitated the spot a few years later with Triple H where Foley went through the cage, but this time they kind of sunk the ring in so that it would take more of the impact. This was just a straight impact down at the center of the ring and with no give, and had Mick Foley pass out. And you had all these people come in. I believe the first person there was Terry Funk to check on how Foley was doing, because they knew right away that this was not supposed to happen. And they talked about how Foley was down and they had to improvise. They talked about how, you know, Funk went after Undertaker and they kind of planned out their spot from there. And so it is quite a visual. And that one was very engaging because that one, like what you were saying with the first one, where it felt like they were protecting the mystique of the first spot. This one, it definitely felt more like, okay, this is real. We got to change our mindset here. We got to change some things on the fly because Mick Foley is out, and we are concerned about how he's going to be doing. And that's saying something in a guy like Mick Foley, where they, discussed in the first part of the episode all his background, wrestling in Japan, in those death matches with Onita and Funk, and taking all these hellacious bumps in ECW, and now carrying over into WWE, WWF at the time. And yeah, it's that was, to me, what some of the more interesting aspects of this show, of this episode, where they were able to kind of break that down and say how they were able to call things on the fly with, Funk doing a bump with Undertaker, and then Foley kind of getting back and them kind of continuing their match. And even with all of that, they still, put in thumbtacks into the middle of the ring and were continuing their match. It was really well done at that point, kind of breaking down how the match sort of broke down and how they were able to continue on after that big spot.
Would you view this match any differently if they called the match off after the second spot?
I wouldn't have. Just looking at it again, I would have viewed it much the same. If anything, I know there is that image of, the tooth being through Foley's nose, and the way that they described that as well was just unreal. But I think if it was just those two spots, I think this match would still be living on in infamy, for those two spots. But it is Mick Foley, and he's one of those guys that has always been, I'm going to continue on until, the bell rings and we get through the finish. So for me, it wouldn't have changed much. I mean, those are two of the most notable bumps in the history of Hell in a Cell that took place in that match. So, but it also doesn't surprise me with Mick Foley's history that he would continue the match and still try and do the other spots, like I mentioned, with the thumbtacks and whatnot, and some of the hellacious bumps.
But I'm talking from the WWF's point of view at the time. Do you think after the second bump they should have stopped it?
Oh yes, absolutely. If this was modern WWE, like with what we know now about concussions and all that, this would absolutely be it would have been, quite frankly, called off after the first spot in my mind. But the second spot, definitely, especially with how long Foley was out, like that, it would not continue after that.
Yeah. So of course it's hindsight, and sometimes things just happen in a place, in a time in history that they wouldn't have happened 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later. A lot of life goes that way. But this, to me, was, when you go back and look at it, after the second bump, I understand after the first one that they continued.
Yep.
Not that I would have thought that that was appropriate now if it happened, but I do understand that was a planned thing. And if he was even like okay enough to go on and told people he was okay to go on, which we never heard, but I'm assuming happened, I think I would have been okay with it. I do think you could have called the match off, the Undertaker leaves, and Mick Foley pulls himself up, sticks the tongue through the mouth with the tooth and the nose and all of that stuff, and still got the, I'm not going to ever lie down. I'm not going to give up. I'm going to stand back up, and you can't kill me no matter what. And got the exact same effect, and still called the match off at that point.
Mm-hmm.
In hindsight, that's what I think should have happened. And I guess I would present to you that was in 97, correct?
This Hell in a Cell match, I think, was 98.
98. Okay. Yeah. So even more proves my point. In June of 98, what happened less than 1 year later?
That would be the Owen Hart stuff falling to the center of the ring.
That would be correct. This would have never happened after the Owen Hart thing.
Oh, definitely.
Right? So all of this, if it's planned for 1 year later, never happens. Because as soon as Owen Hart tragically fell to his death in May of 1999, all of that stuff would have never, ever, ever been allowed. So sometimes it's just the right time and the right place. In hindsight, I would have, if I were the company, called it off. At that point, you still could have accomplished everything that you wanted to accomplish and tried at least to protect the well-being. And again, I know it's a different time and era, and we're talking almost, 27 years ago. I didn't think, and maybe this is what Dark Side of the Ring is all about, that you should, there's this story. But first of all, the Doctor, I didn't think came across very well at all.
Yeah, let's talk about the Doctor pretty quickly. Francois Petit was his name. He played a character in the Mortal Kombat Annihilation movie, I think it was. And if you have not seen Francois Petit and the way that we've described him, the vision you have of Francois Petit is likely accurate, because he was quite the character, the way that they presented him on this show. The Doctor didn't come across as let's just say the physician that they brought out there with Francois wasn't exactly a lot of people's idea of a ringside doctor.
So in saying that, I know that we know a lot more 27 years later in the world of head injuries and CTE and concussions, all of that stuff. However, for them to come out and say that he was not even treated for a concussion after the match, that is wild to me, Zach. I know that we've advanced. I know, but come on. Still 1998. People were getting concussions. They said in this show that he was not treated for a concussion afterwards. How do you ever watch, well, both of them, but how do you ever watch the second one and not treat the guy to maybe assume that he has a concussion until you rule it out?
Yeah.
He didn't remember the thumbtacks. Did we get to the thumbtacks? And he had the thumbtacks in his back. That's correct, right?
Yep.
He was asking if they got to the thumbtack spot while they were pulling thumbtacks out of his back.
Yep.
But they didn't treat him for a concussion. That's wild to me. Wild. And I look, it's called Dark Side of the Ring for a reason, but that doesn't make anybody look very good.
No, definitely not. And it's not like concussions just became a new thing in the last couple of years. Like, concussions have been something that's been around for a long time. We know more about the effects of it now, but we knew what concussions were in the 90s. There could have still been at least some sort of check to see for concussions.
Yeah. And so I bring that up for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's just crazy to me that you can trot out a doctor and put him on television and then have somebody say that nobody treated him for concussions after showing all that. I just don't even know how Francois allowed that footage to air or thought that that was a good idea to go on the show. Because that happened in 1998. And nobody treated that guy for a concussion after he wondered if a spot happened while they're pulling the thumbtacks out of his back. Crazy. And I bring that up too, Zach, because that's me crapping on the WWF and the lack of care for their talent, and Vince McMahon going up to him at the end of the show and going, "Thanks for what you did for my company." Like, okay. Are you okay, Mick? But thanks, what you did for my company.
Yeah.
So the WWF has a lot of blame in this spot. But I'd also like, if I'm trying to be fair, I'd also like to put some blame, and a lot of blame, on Mick Foley and his wife. Because one of the things I really walked away from this show, and I knew a lot about the show. I knew a lot about the incident, but what I think is crazy to me, I even understand the Mick's wife Colette being angry after the Hell in the Cell because she wasn't told about the second one. And the second one was an accident and she didn't know. And then, like, I don't know, would nobody have thought to have called her from the WWF at the time?
Right.
Nobody thought to say, hey, we're going to call the wife just to make sure she knows right away that he's somewhat okay, because he's not actually okay, because he doesn't even remember the thumbtacks.
Right.
So maybe he doesn't know to pick up the phone, or he's not in that state. Well, we're going to let her know. No, they didn't do that. So I understand her anger and her frustration about that whole situation. Why she was letting her kids watch that, knowing that their father was going to be thrown off the top of a cage. She knew that. And she let the kids watch anyway. Okay, I'm not their parents. They're their parents. Totally understand. Your decision. Because nobody can tell the parents what to do if the parents kind of know and make those decisions together. They're the parents.
Yep.
So there isn't any being critical of that. But I would like to be a little critical of the fact that, Zach, they showed, and I think maybe reminding me that it wasn't, 7 months later, after that horrifying experience, I would guess, for Colette and the kids, Noelle and Mickey, however old they were, it would have been a horrible experience. She's described it as a horrible experience.
Yep.
They then sat front row 7 months later for The Rock and Mankind, knowing that he was going to take chair shots. And watching those kids cry and Colette cry. And Zach, explain to me, and I know you don't have kids and I don't have kids, but for all the parents, if you watch the show and then you watched your significant other being thrown off the top of this cage and then take a crazy accident bump through the cage and be knocked out, and you know your kids and significant other were watching, why on earth would you ever 6 or 7 months later let them sit front row for a very, very gory thing? Why would you do that?
Yeah, I don't know. It was one of the things that I never truly understood when it comes to that. It was interesting. Now, I will say this was another kind of one of the things they talked about with The Rock and Mankind, the I Quit match for the WWF title, that the chair shots to the head that Foley took in that match. And they did mention in the show how, Foley did say lay it into him, but with the expectation to be like 4 or 5 shots to the head, which is still a lot. And then I think, what did they say? It was like 11 shots or something
11.
like that.
Yeah,
which is crazy.
And I know, and I'll let you continue, but 4 or 5 heavy chair shots with your hands tied behind your back and direct blows to the head, even if it's 4, Zach, your kids and wife are sitting front row.
Yeah, absolutely.
They just watched you fall off the top of the cage and get chokeslammed through the cage and knocked unconscious with your teeth coming through your nose 7 months ago. I don't, even if it's 4, I don't understand.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt about it. Yeah, they showed those clips. That was from Beyond the Mat when they showed the clips of Foley's wife and the 2 kids there. And they did mention with Noelle, the daughter, how she doesn't remember anything from that match, even though you could see like her watching it, she doesn't remember anything from that match, and quite frankly said that she doesn't want to go back and watch that match because it just horrifies her. It's something that I never really truly understood. Where you just kind of have that, not only just those two spots, but just the kind of performer that Mick Foley is in of himself, right? All the crazy bumps that he's taken over the years, all the big spots that he's done, whether it be, in WCW when he, landed head first onto the outside, taking a bump, losing his ear, and then you go to Japan and then the stuff with the fire and all that. You go to ECW with some of those bumps as well.
Barbed wire. Yeah.
Barbed wire, yeah. So it's like not even just those two spots, just the kind of performer that Mick Foley is. It's just something that never really added up in my head for that sort of stuff. And clearly it's something that especially the case of Noel, was not something that they were particularly fond of when it comes to remembering what their dad did. So that one always just kind of took me aback on why have that be shown in front of your kids. So
yeah, and look, again, I want to be very clear. If you're the parents and you think it's okay for your kids to go through that and you put them in those spots, you're the parents.
Yep, absolutely.
Right? You're the parents. What I don't like about it is that they knew he was going to be thrown off the top of the cage. And when I say they, I mean Mick and his wife. They both knew he was going to be thrown off the top of the cage in Pittsburgh. And they both knew that he was going to be hit in the head with at least 4 chair shots with his hands tied behind his back. They knew that.
Yep.
And if you want to let your kids watch that and think that they're going to be okay and everything's going to be fine, you're the parents. It's your decision. You can't complain about it later. You can't say how horrible it was. And like how tumultuous this time was on TV later, because you knew it was going to happen. So that's the part where I think that there's some responsibility. Again, not telling them how to parent. They can do anything they want with their kids if they think it's proper. I'm not their parent. But if you knew all this was happening, going on television years later and saying how horrible it was and that how angry his wife was and all of this stuff, like that's a little, I guess, not as responsible as I would like them to be.
The consequences of your actions, one might say.
Yes, that's all.
Yep, I agree with that.
So I didn't love that, but look, this is Dark Side of the Ring. I keep saying it. There are no endings where you go, oh, okay, one for the good guy at the end. This is telling stories about the other side of wrestling, and I think some of it was interesting. So as somebody who knew a ton about this, Zach, what was your biggest takeaway from episode 1 of Dark Side of the Ring?
My biggest takeaway wasn't necessarily everything when it comes to the match itself. A lot of it for me wasn't new information. I mentioned with the stand-up tours that Foley had done in the past, I was at one of those shows when he did it in Ottawa a couple of years ago now, and where he was talking about this match. So a lot of these details that were kind of laid out were not necessarily new to me, because I remember watching that show and actually chatting with Foley a little bit after that. What kind of took it away from me is just somebody that kind of watches the modern day product. And we always, talk about these big spots that particularly AEW does when it comes to, how they look at hardcore spots. Like we saw, a couple of weeks ago when it comes to the Jon Moxley spot with the baseball bat and the nails in the baseball bat. But in the past, they've done stuff with glass and whatnot. It's interesting to kind of look at it from this perspective now, and we look at the one spot in its how do I say it, in isolation. Nowadays, you see the one big spot that they do, then you look back at a lot of the Foley spots that he did in the late 90s, and a lot of them wasn't just the one spot, right? Like we were just talking about the chair shots to the head multiple times, the multiple instances in the Mankind versus Undertaker match. I think that's one of the things that I kind of took away, is just how much like they've lessened a lot of that over the years when it comes to taking those big risks, and they try and use those riskier spots if they want to do it and use it as the focal point of one part of the match now. And so that was sort of my takeaway when I watched all this, was actually kind of how much it's kind of evolved in terms of, you know, instead of just doing a lot of spots, a lot of these riskier spots, they've kind of relegated it now to where they'll do the one risky spot, but that's going to be the story coming out of the match, as opposed to we're just going to, you know, beat the crap out of you. So that was sort of my takeaway with this.
I think my biggest one, and so when he was Cactus Jack, where was he hailed from? Do you remember?
Truth or Consequences, New Mexico?
Yep. It's good, Zach. And I ask you that because at the end of it, it's exactly what I thought of. And I mean it this way. The truth was that Mick Foley was willing to do things to put himself in the lore of the history of the sport, and he wanted people to accept him and like him his whole life. He was willing, and maybe this is the best way to put it, the truth was he was willing to take on the consequences of what those decisions were. He made a choice a long time before that. This was not going into the match thinking, I'm going to take a big risk to try and put myself in the lore of the history of professional wrestling. He wrestled that way all the time, as you said, years and years before that. Barbed wire, exploding matches, loses an ear, crazy spots. This guy was Cactus Jack 10 years before that.
Yep.
And did all sorts of crazy things because he wanted to put himself in a spot where people remembered him more than any other. And the truth is, they do. And the truth is, he has to live with the consequences of that. And he's living with those consequences right now. And these were all choices that he made and wanted to make. And there's some respect for me for that, for those decisions. It's a little bit selfish, for sure, when you have a wife and kids, to put that ahead at points of what the rest of your life is. But that's his decision. It's not mine. So a little bit selfish, and also someone willing to put themselves in a spot where they could be remembered for the rest of their life and a long time in the history books of the world of professional wrestling. We'll never forget that spot. We'll never forget that match. And quite frankly, we'll never forget a lot of things that Mick Foley has done. And I just thought of that Truth or Consequences thing as I watched the ending, going, he was hailed from Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. And there's a lot of truth to the fact that he'll have to live with those consequences for the rest of his life. And so will his family. Episode 1 of Dark Side of the Ring. Doc, this has been fun, and we're going to dig right into it. I believe next up is Ludwig Borga.
Yeah, that's what it looks like on my run sheet. Is next episode will be Ludwig Borga. That's going to be what I'm interested in based on some of the previews that they've put out and whatnot. It's going to be a lot of new information for me, so I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, somebody not very well known, was in the WWF for a short time, but has a pretty dark history after that time. And as you said, not a lot known about him. So we'll find out in episode 2, but this has been real good so far, and love exploring some of the different, particular aspects of the world of professional wrestling, even if they're not these like crazy happy-go-lucky endings. fun times to be able to dig into the history of pro wrestling. So episode 1 in the books. Ludwig Borga on deck coming up next week. For Zach McGibbon and Lee Versage, thanks for listening to the Dark Side of the Ring edition of This Is Wrestling.